That wasn't the hard part. Hearing November 31st. And the second part was, what about the embarrassment of because now I just had to have a summit. Hitting it in the nose with a 2x4 nail. Still,
This is what you're saying. And then because of very
Do you need a gavel?
other areas.
All right, we'd like to open the October 5th meeting of the Greenland Planning Board. Could I have a roll call, please? Jerome?
Scott Baker, Paul Sanderson.
Katie Padera.
James Connolly, alternate.
Yes, yeah,
Okay, please note for the record we have a quorum and we are recording the proceedings. Item 1, and the only item on the agenda tonight, would be rising water levels in Great Bay. We have some terrific people here from Rockingham Planning Commission. Done a lot of work and a lot of research on this topic. And leader there, Julie. Thank you very much.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know there are lots of good sports on TV tonight, and you had other options, so thank you for coming here tonight to be with us. So what we'd like to do first, before we start presentations tonight, is just have you pause for a few moments, and you've all been poring over the maps that are on your tables already. I see that you've been doing that. We'd like to give you a few more minutes to continue to look at the maps and look at the report, the Sea Rise report, which is the vulnerability assessment that was completed for the town of Greenland. We also have larger format maps up here. They're a bit larger, and you can see a little bit more detail. So please feel free while we take 10 minutes or so to come up and look at these larger maps if you like to. So I just kind of want to give you a little brief description of what you're looking at. So what we did with this vulnerability assessment was we evaluated flooding, the spatial extent of flooding, in two different ways. First, we looked at sea level rise. We looked at 3 scenarios of sea level rise projected out to 2100. And we looked at 1.7 feet, which is the low scenario. We looked at 4 feet, which is the intermediate scenario, and we looked at 6.3 feet, which is the highest scenario. So those are scenarios of projected increases in sea level out to 2100. So then we took that same information and we laid it on top of what today you would have what kind of flooding you would have today for a 100-year storm event. So we took the 100-year storm event elevation and sequentially added those 3 sea level rise scenarios on top of those to see how sea level will affect the floodplain in the future. So that's what the pink maps are. So some of you have the green map and some of you have the pink maps. I apologize, we didn't print enough for all the tables tonight. So the colors, the lighter colors are the lower scenarios, light green, and the darker colors are the highest scenarios. So you can see that there's sea level does inundate quite a large area and along the Great Bay and the shores of the Great Bay and some of the tidal tributaries here in Greenland. And then storm surge, occupies even more space with respect to potential flooding. So that's kind of what these maps are about. And so this is the legend that shows you what the different colors represent. And these are the sea level rise, the graph of the sea level rise scenarios that we actually looked at. And this is up here on the axis of the 2100 to year 2100. It also reports the year 2050 right over in the center. And the highest scenario for sea level is 2 feet at 2050. And that's sort of equivalent to the 1.7 feet of sea level rise. That would be the light green color. So under the highest sea level rise scenario at 2050, the light green flooding may be something that you see twice daily with tide. Possible. So that's how you kind of read these maps. And I know everyone's probably busily trying to find your house, right? Where are you? Where do I live? And how does this affect me? So if you want to just pause for a few minutes and look at it, and you're welcome to get up and look. I apologize I didn't print more maps for you. Look at the maps. We're going to have a few people that are here with me tonight. Chris O'Keefe from the Great Bay National Estuary Research Reserve, and Natalie Morrison from the New Hampshire Coastal Program, kind of floating around to answer any questions that you have. There are copies of the Sea Rise report on the table. each one of the tables that you can reference, and that's where these maps actually, information from these maps is contained in that report. Some of the detail that's actually in the report that doesn't show up on these maps is that what we did once we mapped all these scenarios is we actually laid on top of them layers of digital information about different assets that the community might be interested in knowing if they were impacted or not. So those are things like roads and culverts and bridges, critical infrastructure like emergency management facilities, natural resources like wetlands and tidal marshes, and sensitive habitats, rivers and streams. There are several instances where freshwater streams may become inundated with saltwater over time, and that will change their character. It'll also change, for example, if that stream crosses a road and it has a culvert in it right now, a culvert that's not designed for bidirectional tidal flow. It's only designed to flow water one direction. So looking at those places on the landscape where some of the infrastructure might need to be modified in the future to accommodate changing conditions. So all of that information is summarized in the Sea-Rise report, and I have a couple slides in my presentation that will sort of summarize some of those impacts. So we're able to give you the community statistics: how many road miles, how many culverts, how many facilities, how many miles of river, how many acres of wetlands, how many acres of actual upland. Upland meaning anything that's above high tide would be impacted by sea level and impacted by storms. That's a really important piece of information too. So we're just going to float around for a few minutes and have you continue to look at the maps for a couple of minutes so you have a little bit of a background as I and Natalie go through and talk to you about the different components of coastal risk assessment that the Seacoast New Hampshire has been doing over the last couple of years. So we're just going to float around for a few minutes and answer any questions that you have. And do you want me to bring these over here so you can look at them? Or I know you've all seen them before, haven't you? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Where is the ladder? Is it in the title?
Right under 33.
Oh, it's where it crosses.
Right
Where it crosses.
there. Right there.
Okay, so is it on the downstream side or the
It goes down. Right underneath the road.
Fish
Yeah.
from one height down.
That's because. So essentially, yeah, so you can have
So this red is a storm surge, 100-year storm. Okay, so that would be like a high tide and a surge.
Well, we're not considering a storm with high or high tide.
Okay, all right.
But we actually measure the containment in high water.
So,
Now, is this the sea level rise anticipated or possible?
Protection based on our gas emissions. So the higher the scenario, the higher the
Here we have
So the higher
Keep going way beyond,
Mine's on.
like,
not owning the phone. Wanting to have it stay.
all right.
the RER
Then it's all
Red is at 6.3 feet, right?
left 100 years.
That's the right
At
of
the
way.
100-year point, right?
That's what it is, at.
And this is laid out currently or recently?
Last year.
Okay. So what's under there, that dam or fish ladder or whatever you want to call it, has been taken into account. So this presumably would reach that,
the lightest one on.
so that got flooded. Am I interpreting that correctly?
It's also an automatic plan.
So the way the thing is actually mapped, we base our
Again, I didn't have any problem with details. But
Right, yeah, right. Topographic.
But an engineer gave them a copy.
Right.
They didn't know this was done. Oh, I could run
Right.
parcels back.
11.5 feet. So I just want to.
Put on the house, by the way.
I think everything is based on like the nature of
So like heavy tide. Comes up to a certain point, it's definitely salty, fresh water, and it's certain. The river was never impacted by the dam, and now what we call a fish ladder, although it's not that. But you would have a point where eventually it was just all fresh water.
It's only a 2 cross road.
So it's only what? Tide is where the
The
point.
right of way, there's 2 rods, the way of measuring, it's only 33 feet wide. That's our right of way now,
Actually, the result of what you were just talking
it's
about.
very over,
It's not, because
it's very narrow right of way. What we don't.
So this is the result of what's coming out of Great
correct,
Bay.
never mind.
Never mind what's
I
coming
gotta call it
right
Aaron.
downstream.
That are inundating all the land around you and contributing to flooding of the zone.
Right, so that's the other component that we tried to not look at, except for the
Grade comes down, so
vegetation,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
going up.
But we did not evaluate flooding,
Now they're gonna do that by the end of the month. It's all rough grading.
So if you had a high tide, it's gonna push the water. The water coming down this way.
Right.
This is gonna be for,
People are gonna come in, stay for a while, and
Because that water.
come and watch you kids practice.
No, just showing you, say you, high tide were extended.
Only based on the Great Bay,
That's what we go.
I didn't realize.
right? So
Yes.
the water's really flowing.
Oh, there's a parking lot right here. So are they walking up here? Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like.
Big
Yes.
parking lot. People come up.
In most
I mean, they
cases,
got all these improvements.
Talking about, right?
in most cases, especially on the Grand Bay, the 500-year floodplain is not that much larger than the 100. It is in some spots where it's very low lying.
Yeah, well, that's why, that's Paul.
But for the most part, there's enough topographical.
They knew.
Here that 500 years. And we actually looked at the 500
They were in the road. Yeah.
And even actually in some of those communities, 500-year floodplain was catchy. In some places it got bigger. I don't know. And then other places not too much at all. Because the topography goes up and up. High moves to that. But the 100-year floodplain,
I don't know, Bay Street.
tide, I think storm surge around here is probably somewhere on the top.
This is the other day, we have a, Eric's gotta look at it.
Down at the beach on it.
Tell them to come in 2 weeks.
yeah, ah, good.
I haven't had a chance to do all of this stuff yet.
It's a pretty big change. That's looking this way.
As far as coastal storms, 100 years high, which is different than a 100-year precipitation event.
So I'll put it on for discussion.
Very few. Elizabeth 78 was greater than 100.
You want it notified?
After the course.
Wow. Well, I guess
The 100-year storm.
That was a random.
they just come up, you may decide you're not gonna support it.
That was
But they wanna get it done this month.
You don't even know how many trucks they have. They're all
They'll do it. They'll do whatever they want.
living there. Decades.
But it's- obviously, they don't wanna delay their contract on it.
And again, have a really big, our peak is up from probably 100 feet.
And I don't know if we have enough time to notify.
Point,
No, it's have to go tomorrow.
maybe 300 even. That's the area that got inundated. Right here.
We worry about making that.
Which is inundated from the north versus Shaw Brooks Marsh swelling.
It's true, because the people get dropping it off. That's the direction.
Hold on.
And there are conversations with their teams about flood issues. One thing that we always forgot to mention is that a lot of communities are having adopt buffers and wetlands.
It's specific hours, you know, like McDonald's, but.
See all the water when it's that's the place for the water. You have a nice little wetland or large wetland. Those areas around it are where this one doesn't have water.
If we had
Last.
designed it, that whole,
She's got space in
there's gonna be an acre of land there.
Watch, they're gonna come in, they're gonna
2 feet underwater. Then we would have way more coming up.
well, we can look at each one.
So,
Yeah, they get
puts
all
them in a pickle, but
Well, the next phase, we're hoping to, we're
I don't know if they're gonna have time to notify, so if you don't have time to notify, they can have that discussion, but if you say, yeah,
when we bring these assessments forward.
support it,
What about the
notify.
High water tables or.
Well,
They remember, they got this schedule, you have weeks, this unit, you get there, and we'll get close to this.
We're trying to find out data how.
Plans usually open this.
It's going, reacting.
Fire doesn't care.
The water's coming through so fast, because especially in places down here. A lot of the watersheds are heavily developed even up in the higher parts of the watershed. So cumulative impact of all that water,
I'll talk to
at
them.
some point.
Talk to Eric's about it.
Watershed
I mean,
rates,
our standard roads.
the channel is gonna go flow somewhere else.
Especially if you're gonna have more. I know one of the things that to extend the
It's already
current
reviewed.
permit for
Right, right. It was gonna be 22.
address that here.
Yeah, but we're
It was originally gonna be 22.
We have really powerful valves.
Yeah, Angela.
All right. So we're gonna talk about this.
You just go.
120 gallons of water, 1,000. One big long house. Yeah. Valley.
I have very good
well, we have a house.
Puddles, they eventually drain, but
Yeah, but it's not fast.
Okay, I think we're gonna get started with our program for tonight, in just a minute.
Was this area being?
So you've had a chance to look at the maps now and maybe become a little bit familiar with what the assessment was all about and sort of where you see flood impacts occurring in the community, and hopefully you all found your house or your best friend's house or your daughter or son's house and you know where they are on these maps. So our program tonight, our agenda is going to, we already had our welcome and a review of our maps. We're going to have, Natalie's going to review an overview of the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazards Commission report. There's a desk, a display copy at the back. I think you have the URL, right? Well, we can send around, or if you're interested, we can send you a link to where this report, very lengthy report, lives on the internet. Natalie and I spent a good part of, a year and a half, as well as President Peter Kinner on the Coastal Risk and Hazards Commission to write this report, and we're very proud of the results of it. And we hopefully you find it very useful. And then I'm going to give you a review of Greenland's vulnerability assessment, the Sea Rise report that's on your table there. And then we're going to have questions and answers after all that information is dumped on you. And then talk about next steps, what steps the community can take moving forward with using this information, implementing some strategies and actions to make the community less vulnerable to flooding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Not really.
I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I'm gonna use the microphone.
good, that works. Or,
Is this thing on?
Oh,
Okay. Hi again, my name is Natalie Morrison, and I'm a coastal resilience specialist with the New Hampshire Coastal Program, which, for those of you that don't know, is a part of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And I was asked to provide you all with some context as to what's been going on at the state level with regards to coastal planning for coastal flood risks. So I'm going to start by providing you, as Julie mentioned, with a really high-level overview of the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazard Commission report and the ongoing New Hampshire Setting Sail project, which aims to support both state and municipal implementation of the Commission's recommendations. To give you some background on the Commission itself, Seacoast Senators David Waters, with support from then Senator Nancy Stiles and Senator Martha Fuller Clark, introduced Senate Bill 163 back in 2013, which established the Commission out of the recognition that coastal municipalities in particular were in need of state-level guidance to help them prepare for increasing coastal flood risks. The legislation that resulted had several attractive features, which I really believe helped contribute to the Commission's overall success. The first of which was that it established a clear and focused mission, directing the Commission to both review best available science, especially that coming out of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and to develop recommendations to help both the state and municipalities prepare for storm surge, sea level rise, and extreme precipitation. The second attractive feature was that it appointed a broad-based bipartisan membership comprised of 37 representatives from the New Hampshire House and Senate. All 17 tidally influenced coastal zone communities were at the table, including Peter Kinner as the representative for Greenland, as well as key state agencies and important stakeholders from the insurance and real estate sectors. Lastly, the law scheduled a sunset date of December 1st, which I really think helped force the Commission accomplish its directive within a relatively short 3-year time frame. Things happen pretty slowly in government. In carrying out its charge, the Commission conducted its work in 3 phases, beginning with understanding what we're facing, or in this case, the science behind projected increases in coastal flooding, followed by understanding our risks and vulnerabilities, or the impacts we expect to see in coastal New Hampshire as a result of these projected changes, and finally, understanding what we need to do by putting forth guiding principles and recommendations to help the state minimize their risk and maximize their resilience. The Commission's findings were summarized in a final report, which the Commission unanimously adopted about a year ago now, back in November 2016. For those of you that don't have a hard copy of the report, it is available online. You can download it at www.nhcrhc.org. And we also have a fact sheet in the back that I'll be referencing later on in my presentation that you're welcome to take with you. It's also available online if there are not enough copies today. Time is of the essence this evening. I know many of you must be football fans, so we have a game to catch. So we don't have much time to get into the details of the report, but I do want to highlight some of the information that one might find if you find time to peruse its pages. As I mentioned, the Commission's first task was to get a better handle of what New Hampshire faces. So to do so, the Commission first convened a Science and Technical Advisory Panel, or what we referred to as the STAP, in order to review the best available science and to help the Commission identify future projections for sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme precipitation that coastal New Hampshire should begin planning for the years 2050 and 2100. The STAP's key findings were also summarized in a report back in 2014, also available online, and offer the following projections. With regards to sea level rise, the 2014 STAP report suggests that sea levels in coastal New Hampshire could rise anywhere between 0.6 and 2 feet by the year 2050, and anywhere between 1.5 feet and just over 6.5 feet by the year 2100. I'll point out that these scenarios might sound a little bit different than the ones on the map. That's because the These layers or spatial layers of the sea level rise and storm surge were produced prior to the Commission's report, but we evaluated it, and the maps using these scenarios are well within the margin of error. So you'll likely see, if you were to put these scenarios on these maps, you would basically see the same flooding extents. As Julie mentioned, as these sea levels rise, today's extreme storm surges are expected to have a significantly greater inundation extent, expanding further inland, and result in longer flood durations. Finally, extreme precipitation events are also projected to increase both in frequency and magnitude. However, at the time of the staff report's publication, climate models were still unable to really precisely estimate future changes. So as a result of that uncertainty, the staff recommends that projects being constructed before 2050 be designed to accommodate current precipitation estimates that are available through the Northeast Regional Climate Center, and that projects constructed post-2050 and beyond be constructed to accommodate a minimum 15% increase in precipitation produced. Recognizing that the science behind these projections is dynamic and seemingly constantly evolving, the Commission recommended, and the legislature has since passed legislation requiring the Department of Environmental Services to update the staff's report at least every 5 years. So our next update is due to the legislature in 2019, and we hope to not only provide you with improved projections for sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme precipitation, but also to include some emerging research from the University of New Hampshire that's investigating how sea level rise affects groundwater levels and areas that may be subject to groundwater inundation in addition to sea level rise and storm surge inundation. Equipped with a better understanding of what we're facing, the Commission then set out to summarize our vulnerabilities to these projected coastal flood risks. It's important to note, as Julie mentioned, that the Commission didn't conduct any new studies for the purposes of developing its recommendations. Instead, they relied primarily on regional vulnerability assessments, such as the Sea Rise Vulnerability Assessment, to develop its findings. Julie, again, is going to talk to you about the Sea Rise Vulnerability Assessment results in more detail. But in general, the Commission's report looks at vulnerabilities specific to our economy, our built landscape, so structures and facilities, infrastructure, our natural resources, and the cultural and recreational resources that comprise our cultural or our coastal heritage. Recognizing an inherent need for flexibility to address both these and other vulnerabilities, the Commission puts forth 6 guiding principles, which are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll run through them quickly. And those are to act early, recognizing that being proactive often will save you money in the long run. Respond incrementally by taking manageable steps to prepare over time. Revisit and revise by adjusting course as the science improves in order to meet expected conditions. Collaborate and coordinate, not just across sectors, but also across jurisdictional boundaries with your neighboring communities in order to maximize effectiveness. Incorporate risk tolerance in design by designing projects based on willingness to accept risk associated with unacceptable performance. And finally, make no regrets decisions by taking actions for your community that reap multiple benefits or value added, regardless of which flooding scenario takes place in the future. In addition to these 6 guiding principles, the Commission puts forth 35 recommendations and associated actions to achieve its science, assessment, implementation, and legislation goals for a resilient coastal New Hampshire. Science, assessment, and implementation legislation also, there's an acronym, SAIL, in honor of the frigate on the state seal. In general, these recommendations call for periodically refining our scientific understanding of coastal flood risks, completing detailed specific assessments of our vulnerabilities, and implementing strategies to protect, adapt, and sustain our economy, built landscape, natural resources, and heritage. These recommendations are primarily geared towards the state legislature, state agencies, and municipalities. However, successful implementation will require collaboration among these partners as well as other public and private stakeholders. Again, we don't have time to go over these in detail, thank goodness. It is quite a lengthy report. But what we have done is distilled those recommendations that are most relevant to municipalities, and that list is included on the front page of the fact sheet that I mentioned. Without getting into too many specifics, we've broken this list out into categories of actions that municipalities can take to prepare for coastal flooding, including creative ways to secure funding and incentivize adaptation, build awareness and support within your communities, hone in on your community-specific vulnerabilities, planning-related actions, regulation-type actions, as well as investment and implementation of on-the-ground actions. It's certainly a long list to digest, and we definitely recognize that. The Commission's report is just intended to serve as a menu of options for communities to pick and choose from based on your unique needs. It's definitely not mandatory. It's just a guidance document, if you will. Julie's going to get into some specific recommendations that Greenland is already working on or might be interested in pursuing based on the findings of your vulnerability assessment. But before I turn it over to her, I just want to call your attention to the New Hampshire Setting Sail project, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a project which seeks to implement the Commission's recommendations both at the state and local level. And we're doing that by providing outreach and technical assistance to communities within New Hampshire's coast. Of note for this audience, the New Hampshire Setting Sail project is what enabled us to give you this presentation this evening, but more importantly, it's enabling us to provide customized technical assistance to the 10 communities surrounding Great Bay. And I think Julie's going to highlight a project that Greenland has selected to work on moving forward. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Julie, who can cover the Sea-Rise Vulnerability Assessment results with you in more detail. And I think we'll hold questions until the end.
I think the microphone is a good idea. Kind of a big room. Not really.
Okay, I'm sorry. I probably should have stepped back a little bit when I first started the introduction to tonight and to let you know that I'm kind of the pinch hitter tonight. I'm not the all-star working with Greenland. As Natalie mentioned, this is part of the project called SAIL, Science, Adaptation, Implementation, and Legislation. It was a grant from NOAA that allowed Givner, Great Bay, the Coastal Program, the Regional Planning Commissions, and others to provide technical assistance grants to local communities, the 10 Great Bay communities. And Greenland applied for a grant, and they selected to work on doing outreach and also to work on developing a coastal hazards chapter of their master plan. And the person who's been responsible for working with Greenland on the Sea-Rise project, which preceded this, and this current project is Teresa Walker, and unfortunately she couldn't make it tonight. She had a family emergency. I'm actually working with 2 other coastal communities in our region. I'm working with Newington and Exeter on similar projects. I just wanted to give her the credit due that she's the one who put all this together and then this event together. So Greenland's vulnerability assessment. We've already had a chance to look at these maps. So the idea of creating a chapter for the master plan is focused on the results of the Sea-Rise report, the vulnerabilities that the report documents and ways, and coming up with ways of discussing with the planning board and others, people like yourselves who come out tonight to give us some feedback about what strategies and actions would be appropriate for Greenland to undertake to address their flood vulnerabilities. For those who aren't familiar with the planning process, master plans are, in New Hampshire, what we call enabling documents. And they're required, every town's required to have a master plan. They're required to have a master plan that has a vision section, a transportation section, and a land use section. But a couple of years ago, the legislature passed a new statute that allowed communities to adopt a coastal hazards chapter that addresses flood impacts to property and habitat along the coastal areas. So this is a brand new enabling statute that allows communities to explore this topic, which has become very important, I think, in the eyes of elected officials and people in the community, as you start to see more flooding happening on the landscape due to sea level rise and storm surge, but also from freshwater flooding. So, so the enabling component of master plans is that if the community wants to take action to change zoning, for example, or change a regulation, or to invest in certain policies or implementation strategies, those items, those actions need to be justified in their master plan, supported in the master plan. So that's why it's really important to craft a coastal hazards chapter so that the community will be enabled to take action in the future. And the recommendations that go into that chapter don't have to be site-specific necessarily, like we want to fix this road or replace this culvert, but they need to be broad enough but detailed enough to be able to give a nod to a certain activity, and we're going to go through some of those recommendations in a little bit. How well can you see that? Kind of okay. So this is a table out of the Sea Rise report, and it does kind of give an overview of the different impacts in the community. I'm going to look at this over here. Let's see here. So you can see that there's not a lot of critical infrastructure in the flooded areas or the areas that are at high risk of flooding in Greenland. And actually the amount of road impacts are quite small. It doesn't look like there's probably too much impact to any state highways. It's probably mostly local roads in the subdivisions that surround Great Bay and the tidal tributaries that drain to Great Bay. So you can see that only 0.2 miles under the highest scenario, sea level scenario, are impacted, and about 1.4 under a storm surge scenario. So that's quite low. I'll tell you that when I worked on this assessment for the coastal communities, the Atlantic coastal communities, they have road impacts in the tens of miles, 10s, 20s, 30. Rye, in particular, Hampton and Seabrook are all heavily impacted as far as roads. So these numbers are quite low. And when we did this assessment and we started to see some of the statistics coming through, we actually were thrilled. Like, yay, the numbers are low. That's it's like no is always is a valid answer. 0 is actually a good answer. So we were delighted to see that the numbers were drastically lower than the Atlantic coast communities in many instances. So there is a portion of a railroad that is impacted under all the scenarios. There are a number of homes under the highest scenario that could potentially be impacted. Few more homes under a storm surge scenario, with a total of 26 under the highest storm surge and sea level rise scenario. One thing to point out when we looked at this, residential structures, we didn't take into account impacts to septic systems and wells and things like that. We just saw whether the little blip on the map was in or out of the flood area where the structure actually was located. So there may be other assets on residential properties that could potentially be impacted by flooding, but we didn't evaluate that. The level of detail was too great. And this next one is interesting. I think I mentioned this before. The amount of land that today is not subject to any kind of tidal influence that may be subject to it in the future due to sea level rise. And you can see that the number of acres is quite substantial, ranging from 51 acres up to a little over 200, 224 under the highest scenario, and then you can see the numbers corresponding with the coastal storm surge. One thing you might notice in this table, under almost most of the different categories of assets, there seems to be a tremendous jump in the amount of impact when we go from 1.7 feet of sea level rise to 4. And that's an artifact of topography, really. That 4 feet on a fairly flat landscape covers a lot of ground, a lot of land. So we saw that in the Atlantic coast, and we're seeing it here in the interior Great Bay communities, that that seems to be a trigger point. And interestingly enough, I had been talking last year with colleagues from Massachusetts who are doing similar assessments, and they found the same thing. It's just 2 feet of water, doesn't do too much, but you put 4 feet on the landscape. If you were to project this with your own eye, 4 feet across a flat landscape, it covers a lot of area. And so then we're looking at freshwater wetlands. There's a very minor amount of freshwater wetlands associated with your minor tributaries that drain to Great Bay, but quite a bit of salt marsh impact. And this is particularly concerning, I think, in that your salt marshes along Great Bay and your tidal tributaries really act as flood storage areas during high storm events, tidally driven storm events. And the loss of those wetlands can be tremendous for mitigating storm, or reducing the impacts of storms over time. And what happens is that the water level rises, the elevation of the marsh can't keep pace with the rising sea level, and the marshes become open water, become permanently flooded, and become open water or mud flat even. So, and that will all depend on topography. So there'll be areas in Greenland where the marshes may be able to migrate inland if the topography is shallow enough and flat enough. But in many instances, they'll hit basically a wall, literally, in the landscape, and they won't be able to migrate. They'll just become, open water. So not only will you be losing flood storage areas, but you'll also be losing valuable habitat for waterfowl but also nurseries for fish and all the fisheries that we rely on, that we enjoy so much in Great Bay. There are a number of wellhead protection areas, and I think this is acres of wellhead protection areas in the community that will be impacted. I think there are some community wells, probably the golf course. I'm thinking, do you have some condo developments down by the water at all, anything like that? So there are must be some community systems that are located near the water. So that's a system that typically serves a population on a regular basis of, I think it's more than 25 people at any given day. So that's like a school or a large commercial venture or a retail place or a golf club. So there's quite a bit of there's a good amount of impact to those wellhead protection areas that really should be probably looked at in some detail to see what kind of impacts that may happen in the future. And looking at conserved land, there is quite a bit of conservation land in the coastal buffer areas, and that's a good thing actually, having that land protected so that it can accommodate floodwater and there's nothing on it that's negatively impacted. And then the last item is the Wildlife Action Plan, which looks at different sensitive and high priority habitats that may be impacted. And those are mostly coastal habitats, like salt marsh and fringe forested areas around Great Bay. So that's sort of a snapshot of the impacts for Greenland. And again, it's nice to see a few zeros up on that table. This is just a more detail of the roads that are impacted by sea level rise, and the names of the roads are actually named here. Under the highest sea level rise scenario and the highest storm surge scenario, the miles that are impacted. So if any of you live on these roads or whatever, there are only small segments of them actually that get impacted, probably where the road crosses a stream of some kind or a drainage area. That's probably the lowest point of the road. That's probably where these impacts are occurring. We also did do a culvert assessment. The town selected 10 priority culverts that they wanted to have assessed, and the UNH Stormwater Center ran a hydrologic model to evaluate freshwater inputs during large rain events and how the culverts in the community would actually perform. And they are named by their location on the left column, and then we look at the different storm types. So the 10-year storm, 25, 50, 100. And then we also look at what's called an AOP, or aquatic organism passage. How well does it perform providing habitat and being able to pass fish and other aquatic organisms. So just one thing, when we look at something that's failing, it doesn't mean that the water is necessarily flowing over the road under these storm events. It just means that it's at maximum capacity. It means it can't transmit any more water. It typically means that water is backing up behind it a little bit, or that the entire culvert is inundated with water, as opposed to having a little bit of freeboard, a little bit of open space. It's completely filled. That's what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that the water's flowing over the road. So we're hoping that this information will be useful to the road, DPW and road agents in selecting and prioritizing where they may do culvert replacements or infrastructure replacements in the future. especially if there are improvements slated for any one of those roads or the crossings that were analyzed. Certainly, they would want to take into consideration, would it be in the future influenced by tide, by sea level rise or storm surge? That means the design of that culvert would need to be different than if it were just, again, the one-way directional flow of a typical freshwater culvert. And also taking into consideration the designs of how large it needs to be. And that would be considering precipitation, but also the tidal effect if that came into play. So the findings and recommendations. So the Sea-Rise report was produced through a series of meetings with local representatives, so elected officials, board members, municipal staff, and others that came together in meetings and poured over the data, poured over the information, looked at the impacts, and started to try to categorize or prioritize what the community, or give them direction as to what they might want to work on in the future. And they sort of fell into 3 different buckets again. So the highest risk assets and resources in the community were the local roads and culverts, the drinking water wells and septic systems I mentioned earlier, maybe doing some sort of inventory of septic systems, where they're located and how many there are, what the age of those are, and how they may be impacted in the future. The salt marsh and the freshwater wetland impacts, the conservation lands, and the ecological significance of some of those habitats, and some of the residential properties that are bordered and commercial properties that border Great Bay and its tidal tributaries. Some of the lower risk assets are state roads and railroads, and luckily that those are not town assets. They are assets owned either by the state or privately. That's not something you have to worry about. And then other impacts include farmland soils. You have a lot of farmland soils that could be impacted in the future, and we're seeing a resurgence of agriculture in Seacoast, New Hampshire over the last 10 years, and we're seeing a lot of small farms popping up, and which is a great thing for the local economy and for all of us who like to buy fresh produce. But also thinking about the future, that because New England in the future is going to have more water than a lot of areas of the country, if some of the climate projections prove true, New England may become a hub for food growing again. And places like California, Florida may, some of their fields and their agricultural areas may be flooded more frequently and not be able to be viable anymore. California is going to get drier and hotter. So having an abundance of water may become a food hub. So trying to protect some of those agricultural soils into the future may be a good strategy for New England and for the state of New Hampshire. Then again, looking at aquifers, most of Greenland, you have some areas that are served by public water from Portsmouth, but a limited area, right? But most of the residential areas are served by private wells, and that's not uncommon in most communities in New Hampshire. So looking at strategies in the future, if we start to see widespread saltwater intrusion into private wells and into local aquifers, communities may need to band together to find alternative water sources or expand distribution systems and from other municipal sources into other communities to help serve them. So the conversation about water will be one, I think that will be a long conversation into the future, and many aspects will need to be considered. And then looking at the FEMA floodplain. So one of the reasons why we created the pink map, is what we call it, is because we wanted to be able to evaluate and have sort of a looking glass to see where the regulatory floodplain may be in the future. How much larger will it get? How many more properties will it impact? Because that's, as a community, as individual property owners, that is a big deal. Flood insurance rates are slated to increase to basically remove the subsidies, government subsidies that have kept rates low and haven't really reflected the actual risk of policyholders, the risk for individual property, that the flood risk it faces. So the higher the risk, the more vulnerable a property or structure is, the higher the premium is going to be. So evaluating the floodplain, the regulatory floodplain in the future is really important for planning at the community level, but also at an individual property level. So here are some of the recommendations for action. So those were assets and resources of priorities. Now we want to look at recommendations. So one thing that I think the planning board has discussed, and others have discussed about from a regulatory standpoint, is creating a coastal flood hazard overlay district. So basically, this would be some iteration of one of these maps, the pink map or the green map, capturing the areas that are projected to have the highest risk of flooding, and potentially there being different building standards associated with those areas. Recognizing, though, that there already are building standards associated with a lot of the areas on these maps because they already are in the regulatory floodplain and they are required through FEMA to adhere to certain standards of construction. But there may be other things. You may have building siting or site design that takes into consideration the aquifer protection, the wellhead protection areas, where the septic goes, what kind of septic system they put in. So there may be design considerations in that overlay district that will help those properties be more resilient and experience less impact than traditional development might. And so that plays into the second one about looking at how the site plan regulations for commercial development and subdivision regulations can be crafted in a way that that provides for open space, provides for buffers, provides for example, if you have a subdivision, you have open space. The open space are those high-risk flood areas. Those are the areas that get protected as opposed to some of the upland areas. And then again, the siting of septic systems and wells is part of that regulation. Excuse me. From a non-regulatory standpoint, a lot of this kind of falls into a couple of things. So some good housekeeping and some best management practices with respect to culvert maintenance. Really important to make sure that culverts are cleared of debris and are kept flowing freely, but also that when those infrastructure improvements are being contemplated, investment and replacement of culverts, that this information be taken into consideration in the design and the siting of those. Looking at outreach and stewardship programs, having events like this, bringing the public in to give them the information, because I think some of the stuff you learned tonight may be very helpful to you as an individual property owner and the decisions and investments you may make in the future. Land conservation in the floodplain is a really good thing to do, and for many reasons, and just for all the reasons we talked about, whether it's salt marsh migration or habitat protection or just not building in highly vulnerable areas. And looking at ways that we can live near the shore better than maybe we do through living shorelines, having less hardened structures on the shoreline, keeping more natural shorelines with native vegetation and plants, and keeping the shoreline free of human activity. And landscaping that uses native plants and is complementary to coastal habitat. One thing we're actually working on with four communities on the coast right now, the Atlantic coast, is to implement the high water mark initiative from the FEMA program. So it's where we actually selected a location in the community and we benchmark through an installation like of a post or something, or mark it on a building what the highest level of flood has been over time, the highest flood, coastal flood, but then also benchmarking where sea level will be at that location in the future. So many of you, I've traveled quite a bit. I used to live in the Mid-Atlantic in Maryland, and Maryland has a tremendous amount of large river systems and floods, and the downtowns of most downtowns on the eastern shore of Maryland have like a special brick in the theater where the flood of 1958, and it was 10 feet high. So there are many of these benchmarks around the country, and they're really interesting to see. But they're good public information tools as well to let people know that this is what we've experienced in the past, and this is what sea level could be in the future. And of course, planning. And so I had mentioned the coastal hazards chapter of the master plan. It's a really good first step, initial step, I think. Actually, it's not an initial step. Greenland's been working on this issue for a while through the Sea Rise project and now through SAIL. So this is just one of, I think, several actions that the community proactively has been stepping up to the plate and doing to help the community address the issue of flooding. Again, crafting open space plans so to actually, instead of being opportunistic, someone's going to sell a piece of land, let's buy it because it's good open space. How about strategically selecting which lands you really would like to see protected for the reasons of flood, like flood storage and because it's a high risk area. And I think Greenland is in the next round of hazard mitigation plan update, I believe. I'm not sure. I think you might be. So when the next hazard mitigation plan, which is required by the state for the town to have one, you have to have one to apply to actually be qualified for the National Flood Insurance Program and to be qualified for National Flood disaster relief. And this plan outlines all the hazards that the community faces and statistical information about it. But incorporating some of this information from the Sea Rise report will be really important moving forward. It actually also adds credibility and a rationale for applying for grant money to actually do some of the actions that are on this list. So if you have a piece of infrastructure that you want to improve, and it's in your hazard mitigation plan, is something that was identified as part of the flood assessment, the vulnerability assessment, you can demonstrate to FEMA that you've thought this out. You've identified this as a priority, and you'll be more competitive, for like FEMA pre-disaster mitigation funds, for example. Definitely including this information in the capital improvement plan. I've talked a lot about infrastructure improvements, and long-term, capital improvements and investment over time are a wise path forward. And then emergency preparedness and evacuation, people knowing if they're in a high-risk flood area or not. And if they are, whether their road is susceptible, would they get cut off, for example, by a flood and not be able to get out? And when would that be? Would it be early in the storm or late in the storm? And what type of storm would cause that kind of condition? So preparedness and evacuation plans are really important for the community as a whole. Not only for people who may be in harm's way, but also the emergency responders who would be rescuing them or helping them through an event. So that's sort of an overview of I think, the Sea Rise report and what it said, what the community and the planning board are working towards to include in the master plan chapter. And so we kind of wanted to open it up to you as attendees here to kind of give us your thoughts and your ideas, and hopefully Charlotte will get all this down and we'll have them in the minutes. Do you need to have people say their name or anything if they make a comment, or? Okay, so you need to just state your name and name and address if you want to make a comment.
Fairview Terrace. I think so. But under the culvert issue, many, if not most, culverts are jammed.
With debris?
Pardon me?
With debris, you mean?
Debris.
Mm-hmm.
Either it's just debris that's collected from plant life or whatever, or beavers put it in there, and so you got no flow either way until an event, and then it's a response of trying to pump the water out. Secondly, when you were talking about management, the Great Bay is so large that as water rises, and you get a wind-driven storm, you get a fair amount of erosion. Yet, to my understanding, the state doesn't allow anyone to put riprap up. So it seems to me that there are concepts and reasonable tools that can be put in place, but they're disallowed.
You bring up a really good point, and it's not that I'm not sure that revamps are completely disallowed, but they're discouraged, and you have to show just cause and need for something like a hardened structure. Actually, the coastal program is working on a demonstration project right now on living shorelines. It's over at the Wagon Hill property over in, is it Durham or Dover? Durham. It's conservation property. It's got a beach. It's experiencing heavy erosion along the banks and the shore. They lost a lot of marsh, fringing marsh there, and they're looking at designing a living shoreline treatment there. And when I worked in Maryland, I actually worked in this quite a bit. And the way these work is if you take a shoreline and you typically create sort of what's called a low sill with rocks or other structures. And then you fill in with material and you replant marsh back onto it. So you need a way to contain the new land, the new sediment. So sometimes they're made out of sandbag material, but not plastic, but some sort of natural material that would decompose. But you have to kind of corral it, and then you build new land, and then you plant new marsh. And so it's a way to sort of create a new living shoreline where one used to exist. So there are some techniques that can be used to, and it's been very effective in Maryland, actually. In Maryland, they do not allow people to put in new bulkheads and revetments. You can repair an existing one, but you can't make it bigger, and you can't build new ones. So, and they've been very successful with this living shoreline treatment statewide.
But that's Maryland, and you've got an immense
Yes.
area of water.
Yes, the fetch in some
New
parts of the
Hampshire
bay.
is not that forward-thinking, first of all.
Yeah, no, but I mean, there are case studies that show, and that we're hoping the Wagon Hill example will be a good example for how a living shoreline can be recreated in a high-energy environment.
But if you have tree roots that are exposed
Yeah,
because water has just lapped all,
Yeah.
that to me is a sign of an issue waiting to happen.
yes,
Topple trees, and so current legislation and current land approvals and remediation concepts don't allow you to take remedial steps.
that's true. And I agree that the title rules under the DES, for example, I saw a situation like that in Maryland. What they did was they removed the trees because they were falling into the water. They regraded the bank so that it wasn't a cliff. It was more gradual. And then that stopped, and then stabilized the toe of the slope, and that stopped the erosion. And then they replanted it with new trees and new vegetation. And so, yes, under the DES rules, I don't know if that could be permitted or not. And so there needs to be a discussion about what is the best way to treat the shoreline. Just letting it fall into the bay is not a good choice.
Was that a federal grant that did that?
Which one?
The process you just,
No, it was a private property owner who got it permitted through the state of Maryland. But it involves a lot of manipulation of the shoreline, and so I don't know if that would fly here in New Hampshire just yet. But we're hoping that the Living Shoreline demonstration projects will shine some light on this and show people that it is possible to recreate or to restore shorelines in a healthy way that makes them, keeps them natural and not building a bulkhead. Because they certainly at Wagon Hill could build a bulkhead and it would solve the problem, but that's really not the goal.
and of the three levels you point out, one is the 1.7, the 4, and the 6.3.
Mm-hmm.
Is the 6.3 the extreme?
It's the highest scenario. So
Is that a FEMA number?
No, these are numbers that came out of the National Climate Assessment of 2014, I think, or 2013. They're based on sea level rising based on greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So the highest scenario is based on high greenhouse gas emissions, and the lower scenario is based on a lower profile of greenhouse gas emissions and lower warming, less warming.
So is the midpoint more of the area of focus now?
It depends, as Natalie mentioned, the level of risk that you're willing to take. So, for example, there are property owners that live on the coast, Atlantic coast, that have enough money if they get damaged to just continue to repair their homes all the time, and they're willing to take that risk because they have the means to do it. There are other people who are less willing to take the risk because they either don't have the money to do it or just don't want to. You spend money repairing your home all the time, and the disruption that actually causes to your life. So it's about risk and about how longevity of a structure. So if we're putting in a new bridge or something, you want it to last for 100 years. You definitely would want to take into consideration some of these scenarios. I think there's a gentleman in the back.
Leonard Schwab, Great Bay Drive West. What is the percentage of the green that is in the town of Greenland that is already in conservation restrictions?
I don't know that number. It might be in the report. I'm not sure. I did not work on this Sea Rise report. Teresa Walker actually worked with the community on it, so I'm not completely intimate with all the details, but it might be reported in there.
So one of the things that says plan ahead is that towns should develop municipal inventories of land available for conservation. And I agree with that, but we don't know if that's 2% of this is under conservation or 92% is under conservation. So we don't know what we want to do.
I'll make a note of that, and we actually, with our GIS, the staff and in-house at the RPC, we can actually come up with that figure. So I will let her know that you're interested in knowing that, and we can report it.
Thank you.
It's not a hard thing to determine. Any other questions?
I'm not a resident, Bob Najar, Portsmouth, but friend, it'd be interesting to come. And but I'm wondering about the interplay of both seawater rise and surge, and if you're having a big event like a hurricane and there's fresh water coming down in the opposite direction. Well, how does that all work, and how does this, as far as planning?
Right, it's the missing component of these assessments. We, due to budget and just modeling, we couldn't actually do with the freshwater component. But yes, we definitely see the coast, nor'easters that have a lot of rain associated with them. And so on top of a coastal storm surge coming in on a high tide with rain coming in, it only magnifies the effect of flooding. Those waterways get completely overwhelmed, the tide's in and the surge is up and the water cannot discharge itself, so it'll back up on the landscape in a significant way. We saw that in the Mother's Day storms. I mean, how much, just too much rain and too much time, and the drainage systems just couldn't handle it. So we would like to be able to, in the future, get more sources of funding to evaluate, do a more comprehensive view of where the water is coming from and how it reacts on the landscape during intense rainstorms, and then coupling that with the coastal assessment. Right now, New Hampshire is coming up with a protocol to evaluate the freshwater saltwater interface. Right now, there is no model to actually use. There's not one in the country. So New Hampshire is actually developing a model to evaluate how that works. What happens during a low tide? What happens during a high tide? You can only imagine during high tide that the inland flooding would be so much worse because that water just has nowhere to go if it's draining to Great Bay. So we're hoping that in the next couple of years we'll be able to have that model will be done and we'll be able to get money to actually apply it and do those types of assessments.
Are there any special considerations in terms of some of the planning and proactive, into that kind of scenario?
Well, a lot of communities are starting to look seriously at how much impervious cover they've got. In more developed areas, especially the large parts of watersheds and more urban areas have a lot of impervious surface throughout them. Those lower in the Great Bay watershed. And the more impervious cover you have and the more stormwater you're generating, it exacerbates that problem. And so communities are looking towards the stormwater management regulations to get a handle on impervious cover, the growth of impervious cover, but also ways to disconnect the runoff that comes off of impervious cover, i.e. keeping it on a piece of land and infiltrating it as opposed to just collecting it, piping it into a drainage system and off into the stream or waterway it goes. So that's actually one of the best ways to mitigate that whole issue, that problem, is by going back and looking at how we deal with stormwater. And that should be done at the local level, definitely. But some communities, especially ones that are in the western part, west of here, which were quite rural back 10, 15 years ago, have seen population growth of 40 and 50%, and a dramatic increase in impervious cover, and they've seen flooding become worse because of that. So it's a reality, no doubt. So the more we can actually disconnect that runoff, the better off we'd be, and also from a water quality standpoint too.
If you review old deeds and pictures before they started pumping 600,000 gallons, it always wasn't 600,000 gallons of the well water. There's certain places in Greenland that were flooded. Now, pumping that water has reduced that flooding. Do you take any of that into your consideration when you're doing all these assessments?
No, that's beyond the scope of this one. We're looking at just surface flooding, but that's an interesting question. I hadn't heard anything about that scenario here, that pumping water, well water, has reduced flooding or groundwater levels. I hadn't heard that. Any other questions?
Do any of these charts take into account king tide and severe weather conditions like when the bay is totally frozen?
No, but king tide is typically, Natalie might be able to answer this question better than me. King tide is the highest annual tide. Typically, it's astronomical and we influence, and most of them happen in December, the highest of them. But we actually have our King Tide contest, the Coastal Adaptation Work Group that Christos and Natalie and I are part of. We hold a photo contest every year, and people go out during the designated King Tide events and take photographs. And there are many parts of the seacoast that have become infamous photo subjects for this contest, and it's a great way to document, what happens, because people's memory kind of forget what happened, during different floods. This year it's November
5th through 7th.
5th, which is a Sunday, through 7th, which is a Tuesday. So we have several days to go out and take photographs. There's a website you can go on. We can provide that information for you. Do you know what it is?
It's
NHCAW.org.
NHCAW.org.
NHCAW.org. And so you take pictures, and there's multiple ways that you can actually submit them through Instagram and Facebook and all different ways. And we award lots of really cool prizes. And then we have, the contest has really been quite successful over the last 4 or 5 years, I think. So the king tides are like, I think this year, the one in November is going to be 11 feet or something like that. So
Just over 10 on the direct coast. Further inland, along the tributaries, you'll probably see 8.9, 9-foot tides, which will result in considerable impacts, I think.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, king tides are a good proxy of what communities might experience twice daily during high tides with rising sea levels. So that's why we host the contest, in order to kind of raise awareness and help people visualize flooding impacts.
king tide would generally be sort of equivalent to 1.7 or 2 feet of sea level rise. And there are parts around. I know that in Exeter, Swayze Parkway can get flooded during those tides. And Chapman's Landing over in Stratham. They're definitely. I don't know about the golf course if it sees any impacts, but they're definitely on the coast in Hampton and Seabrook. They see lots of flooding on local roads, and the causeway over to Newcastle is inches away from being covered with water. The Bratskeller Pizza place in Portsmouth on Route 1. The floodwaters go right after the front door. They put sandbags in, and people go around the back and to enter the building. Brown's Lobster in Seabrook, the whole parking lot goes underwater. That's a famous place for people to take photographs with the picnic tables half submerged. So it's pretty dramatic. It's an interesting thing to observe. So it's a fun thing to do. Go out, snap some photos, and see if you can win a cool prize.
Did you say that was not taken into consideration?
We didn't really map it. We know generally that king tides are about anywhere between 1 to 3 feet above normal tide. And so when you look at the light green areas on the green map, that's really an equivalent or a proxy of what king tide would look like and where it would flood. When you see king tides, definitely the marshes are completely submerged in water. You barely can see any marsh grass sticking out above them. They are completely filled up.
With king tide rise and regular rise we're going to have, will king tides actually get greater for themselves?
Yes.
Over time?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Because the benchmark, the mean high tide, or the average high tide will be higher than normal as sea level rise, and so then you add the astronomical effect on top of that, then you've got even more flooding. So, Laura?
Could you just go into a little bit more detail, if you've got it, on the issue of impacts on groundwater with the sea level rise? I know that it's still something that is just starting, that people are doing research on, and they're just starting to release some of that research.
Yep.
But,
go ahead.
If you could just, whatever you happen to know about what the impacts between the sea level rise and groundwater might be.
It's been an emerging area of research at the University of New Hampshire. Our PhD student, Jane Knott, has been working on this in creating models to look at the impact or the effect of sea level rise on groundwater levels. And also, did she also look at saltwater intrusion?
Yes, Newmarket has completed a study with Jane looking at saltwater intrusion into drinking water supply.
But as sea levels rise, it basically changes the hydrostatic pressure against the freshwater, interface, and pushes the water up, basically. Pushes it in. So she's been gathering well data from Pease. Actually has lots of they have monitoring wells all over the Pease former Pease base to monitor water quality issues. But she's getting the data because she wants to know what the water elevations are, and she's seen a marked difference and change in water elevations there, that far inland. She's also starting to look on the coast. She's gathered data from Seabrook, the Seabrook Water Department, because they have a large well field just west of I-95 to see if they've experienced similar changes in water levels. So basically what it will do is it will raise the water level in a well, but it also raises the regional groundwater table. So that could result in the emergence of an expansion of wetlands, freshwater wetlands across the landscape. So as the groundwater rises in more places intersects the ground surface, you may have new wetlands emerging and then existing wetlands expanding in their extent because of the rise of groundwater.
That same group at UNH, they started this research looking at the impact of rising groundwater levels on pavements and pavement durability. And so I think that paper was published, and we can certainly provide a link to that as well in the minutes.
Does that paper say anything about septic systems?
It does not.
There's another study actually, though, that the town of Rye has been working on through a grant from the Department of Environmental Services. They're working with FB Environmental out of Portland in the Parsons Creek watershed. It's a watershed in a tidal creek that's been developed for a long time. There are older homes and older septic systems, and they were having water quality issues and bacteria blooms there. So they started to investigate, well, where is it coming from? Where is this water quality impairment coming from? And they realized what was happening was that these septic systems, because of sea level rise, were getting wet from the bottom, and they weren't functioning properly anymore, and they were releasing nutrients into the creek. And so that was one area where they actually they did a whole inventory of properties, and they've done extensive outreach to property owners in that watershed, and they've been able to actually fund replacements of some of the most the worst of the offenders of these septic systems that aren't functioning properly.
Do you have any idea where they got that funding from?
A 604B grant from the Department of Environmental Services, which is an EPA clean water grant.
Can you repeat that, please?
604B, out of the Watershed Bureau, and it's an EPA grant, clean water grant.
The coastal program is also hoping to work with both Jennifer Jacobs and Jane Knott, who's the PhD candidate working on this issue, to secure funding either through NOAA, is probably the most likely source, but in order to use her model to develop groundwater rise zone maps, so and to make that information publicly available so that you can begin doing these types of overlay analysis.
So the other part of that that I think Jane wants to also expand is looking at the effects of saltwater intrusion on freshwater systems, because there are many water systems on the coast, the immediate coast actually, that could potentially be impacted by that. So there's the Rye Water District. There's Rye has a couple of municipal wells really close to the coast. There's Aquarium Water. There's Seabrook Water Department. So looking at that impact over time is really going to be really important. They already test for chloride, for sodium, so we know what the sodium levels are. But it could be an issue moving forward in the future as far as well siting and municipal water supply.
I don't want to, Ann Mayer, Fairview Terrace. I guess I'm a little concerned. You've mentioned funding numerous times in your responses, and at both the state and federal level, we're looking at funding that could be cut drastically for all of these projects. Are there ways that citizens can work, towards making sure that these things don't get cut? Because I don't think they see at the state or even federal level, they see the value in many of these.
Well, I think there are New Hampshire senators actually are quite strong advocates of keeping this environmental funding and NOAA and EPA in place, luckily. But you could call another congressman or another senator in another state that you think that you might be able to influence. But New Hampshire, we've been super lucky. This coastal adaptation work group that I mentioned before, how many are we now? 19, 20?
20 plus.
20 plus organizations. So we're federal, state, local, municipal, regional planning commissions, nonprofits, and academia. And we meet monthly, and we talk to people, we hold workshops, we give information, but we also craft projects. What do the communities need? So the Tides to Storms was one, and the Atlantic Coast was one that we came up with. The Sea Rise was another one. Setting Sail is another one. There are numerous examples of these projects that we've been doing to bring tools and information to communities that they desperately want and need. And we've been successful, I think, $4-point-something million-ish. The tidal interface, freshwater interface, that was also funded through a federal grant. So it's been lots of research, planning, and assessment that's been funded through NOAA and EPA, mostly NOAA and EPA over the last 5 to 7 years. And it's really moved the ball forward for New Hampshire. We've been very competitive. They really like the work that we do. because they see that it's useful and it has utility, and that we get it out to the people who get it in the hands of people who can use it. And so we've been nationally competitive through NOAA, competitive grants through NOAA for years, consecutive years. We are worried about the fate of that funding because we have, as you all recognize, you've all identified more research that we need to do and more analysis that we need to do to answer some of the questions that you're asking us tonight. So it is important that that funding stay in place. It's funding that, in essence, directly trickles down to the communities, and we've made that case. The Coastal Program Director has gone to Washington D.C. and testified on that whole idea that this isn't just research in a bubble. It's research engaging communities, getting them information, and helping them make wise choices. And I think that how can you say that's a bad thing? So write a letter. I think we want to kind of maybe move, if there are any more questions. I thought we had more slides. I guess maybe we don't. Looking at next steps, I think. No, I guess that's it. But I guess maybe handing it back to Stu as far as maybe making a comment about and Mark Fougere, who's the town planner, about what the process is going moving forward with the coastal hazards chapter, what your timeframes are, and if you anticipate having any more public forums, or what your
What have we talked about there?
Your game plan is.
Well, I think as Julie mentioned, the next step.
This is Mark Fougere.
Mark Fougere, the town planner for Greenland. The next step for the planning board would be evaluating the document and then making that a chapter of our master plan. We're right into the middle of zoning season right now, so I would say, early next year, the board would evaluate that, have a public hearing, obviously, that would be published. Any public input that was necessary would take that, and then the adoption process is fairly simple. And then from there, obviously looking at the recommendations, some of them are in the selectmen's hands, some of them in our hands as far as regulatory issues. So
will there be an opportunity for it to be posted online so the public can comment on it or anything like that? I mean, well within before the beginning of next year?
Absolutely.
So that's a good, good way for you to kind of interject your own thoughts and your own, what you think should be included in that chapter. So the adoption process is the planning board works on the document and fine tunes it, creates a final draft, and they notice a public hearing, which the public is invited to go to. If they get substantial comments and believe that amendments or revisions to the document are necessary or warranted, then they make those changes. They hold a second public hearing on the revised document. So that's the process they would go through. But it sounds like the chapter will be made available before that, so that the public can read it and comment.
On our new website.
New website, yay. So
Any other questions for RPC, Julie, and anybody else, or anybody from the board, or any other questions from? No, thank you, folks.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out.
Great job. What do you got over there, Charlotte? What do you like to do those?
Yeah.
I'm very busy.
Modern technology is coming along. We're all going to be 5 years.
Yeah, it is.
Trying to save the
How you doing, sir? Thank you so much. Yeah, great job. Yeah.
down the
Incredible. We were wondering, I would, target lot of it. We're done. We're just gonna do some, oh yeah, okay. Well, I'm here to figure out time tonight. Wait to, I see something. Yeah, we're
What?
Yeah.
So you can hear me?
I agree with you.
For payment of invoices, move to approve payment of the following invoices. From the town planning board budget to the air planning and development, $1,930.60. From the planning board escrow account to office engineering, $450.91.
All in favor?
You're in the middle.
Do sign them.
Well, so this is really.
It should be okay. You don't have to do them if you don't want to. Do we have enough people? You're rolling. I have a motion to approve the minutes of the planning board public hearing for Thursday, September 1st, 2017.
All in favor? Aye. Any nays? Okay. Any other business, Mr. Fujian?
No, sir.
Well, we covered it already.
We did. We'll deal with that at the next meeting.
Do we have a motion?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, really? Wow. Cut it up with that.